Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Mel Blackmore, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Blackmore's UK Limited and Carbonology. And she is also the host of the ISO Show podcast, which we will talk about in a bit. So, welcome to the podcast, Mel.
Hi, Gareth. Great to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So, let's start at the beginning. When did you first get involved in environmental management?
Well, I actually got involved in quality management standards initially. That was because I did a module on total quality management back in my university days. And for some reason, it really resonated with me by having a structure and a clear pathway to help to raise standards in business. And basically, it was about, getting things done to a high standard. Um, so I then went on to work in the public and private sector in quality management before I started my own consultancy business, Blackmore's, back in 2006. And it was through work with clients that we identified that there was definitely a need for businesses, not just to have a quality management system, but to have a holistic business management system that incorporated sustainability as well.
Yeah.
So that was my first foray into environmental standards. I got involved with ISO 14001. Obviously that's the leading environmental standard globally,
Hmm.
created by the International Standards Organization. Uh, but Blackmores have always been at the forefront of the development and implementation of standards. So when a standard for energy management came out, which at the time it was a British standard. Um, for those of you that aren't familiar with ISO standards, quite often before they become an international standard, where there are representation from, say, 50 countries to develop an international standard, quite often they actually start in the UK and the British standard. So they start off as a BS. So BSEN 16001 was the energy management standard that we first started implementing. And I rather cheekily kind of snuck this into a 14,001 pitch for a global data center. And it just so happened that there was the data center manager in there from the Netherlands.
Hmm.
And he said that, yeah, there are increasing regulations coming into effect. This was, I think, back in about 2010. And he was very interested in having a framework for managing energy. And the reason I put in a couple of slides on this pitch around energy management is because I knew, having worked with some data centers, that energy was the most significant environmental aspect,
Hmm.
therefore impact in terms of emissions, and also one of the greatest costs for a data center. So looking at it from a commercial point of view. So it was a bit of a no-brainer for a data center to implement an energy management standard. So that standard quickly became an ISO 50001, and we ended up rolling that out globally for Equinix data center. Then other data centers followed suit. That was partly because we also did some research with the university on looking at the impact that a structure such as 50,001 could have for a data center. So that was really interesting. We've also been involved with other standards. ISO 2012 which I was listening to one of your guests the other day, actually. They were involved with 2012 the Sustainable Event Management Standard
Yeah.
that was launched at the Olympics. But before it was an ISO again, it was a British standard.
Yeah.
So, yeah, championing best practice and sustainability. So that was BS 8901. So we implemented that for some organisations. And then we went on to implement 2012 for stadiums such as Wembley, for example, and other organisations. Since then, we've gone on to focus on other sustainability standards, and more recently the carbon standards. So that's very brief potted history on my involvement with environmental standards, but there are other sustainability standards that we deal with that I haven't touched on.
Yes. And you set up Carbonology as a spin-off company then, am I correct in saying?
Yes, that's right. well, as I mentioned, we're always looking at how standards can help an organisation from an operational perspective, then from a commercial perspective, and then more often than not from a marketing perspective, because businesses want to have some type of endorsement, so they're not just paying lip service for what they say that they do. So a few years ago, I was involved with ISO 14064, which is the ISO standard for carbon footprint verification. We basically did a pilot with a electronic manufacturing organisation across a number of countries. And when we do a pilot, it's really to say, okay, so what tools do we need in order to be able to implement this standard? And what's the ROI? What's the actual benefit of implementing this standard? And is it something that's repeatable, that is going to continue to give value to an organisation? And we identified that, based on the climate emergency, that this is something that we really wanted to focus on as a business. We then implemented PAS 2060, which is a carbon neutrality standard. Now, a PAS is a publicly available specification. So it's not an ISO. And we basically looked at both of those standards together I basically identified that there are 7 steps to achieve carbon neutrality that would be underpinned by ISO 14064 and PAS 2060. When we looked at our stats in terms of inquiries and levels of interest, about 18 months ago, we identified that it was the carbon standards that were really taking off. And at the time, I passionately felt that I didn't want these standards to be treated in the same way as other standards because of the climate emergency, and because I think organisations are still figuring out how they're going to get to net zero. And I reached out to Innovate UK to see if there was funding available, because I felt that we needed to have a digital platform to support consultancy around this area so businesses could do it themselves. So we were very fortunate in getting endorsements for that. And as a result of that, I created and founded Carbonology. So that we started that about 15 months ago now, I think. Yes, and that's going really well.
Right. And you've already discussed 5 or 6 different standards in the sort of 14,000 or 20,000 series. Am I right in saying that the 14,001 is still the only one that you get accredited to, the way you used to on the quality standard, and all these others are more advisory?
Great question. Interestingly, if you go onto the ISO website, if you're interested in finding out more about standards in sustainability, if you go onto the ISO website, you'll be able to identify the technical committees for environmental management and the subcommittees, and how many standards have been created, which standards they are, and also the standards that are in progress. So to answer your question, ISO 14001 is a certifiable standard, but there are a number of others as well. And interestingly, if you look under the technical committee SC1, which was the original committee that created the environmental standard ISO 14001, there are a number of standards there. I think there are about 13 or 14. But if you look at SC7, the technical committee for climate change, there are actually 21 standards there. Now, about half a dozen of those are still in progress, but some of them have been published quite recently, such as ISO 14068, the climate change carbon neutrality standard, which, in my view, will supersede PAS 2060.
Right.
So other certifiable standards in this space, we've got ISO 50001, of course, the energy management standard, which we've seen more organisations achieving certification to, because that can be a tick in the box for ESOS.
Yeah.
Because it goes above and beyond just doing energy audit reports, because it's providing a mechanism to continuously improve and monitor energy management. Then we've got other standards like the Sustainable Event Management Standard, ISO 2012-1. But interestingly, the standards that we're dealing with in the carbon space
Mhm.
are predominantly verification standards. And there's actually a distinct difference between certification and verification.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you ever have any issues with, if a client comes to you and says, I need to sort this out? And given that there's this whole raft, even within the 14,000 series, I don't know how many there are in total. Do you ever have a dilemma of how many to get a particular client to follow, or is it usually fairly obvious what's applicable to them?
Well, I think it's important to ask the question why.
Mm,
Why are you doing this? Why is it important to your business? And what do you want to achieve? And from that, you can quite easily deduce which standards are most applicable.
mm,
So, for example, if it's energy management that is one of the biggest costs for the business, the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, then 50,001, it's a no-brainer. If it's an organisation that's producing, waste, packaging, using a lot of water, for example, then ISO 14001 is the way forward. But it doesn't mean to say an organisation needs to achieve certification.
yeah,
Some companies will view this as being an added expense that's unnecessary. And so what I would advise is to, again, identify why, why is it important to your business, to your stakeholders, and take a look at what's out there. So, for example, there are some guidance documents. So the Sustainable Procurement Standard is one of those that one of your guests mentioned in a previous podcast.
yes,
So yeah, the Sustainable Procurement Standard ISO 2400 is not a specification. So it can't be certified against because
yeah,
it's quite simply, it's not clear enough. Well, it does what it says on the tin. It is guidance. So it's open to interpretation. Whereas a specification is really clear. And I guess that's why I'm a bit of a fan of the standards. This is what kind of drew me to them in the first place. I love the clarity of it, where the
yeah,
standards say shall, there's no questioning that. That's what you have to provide. And I think that's where it's really interesting, certainly in, the carbon standard space, and because of, the greenwashing that's going on, having that clarity, I think it's just, for me, it's something that is very much needed, and also the transparency around it. But just going back to, your question about, how does a business decide? Again, I think you can cherry pick aspects of some of these standards. So you may obviously have quite a significant impact on the environment through your supply chain,
mhm,
and you're looking at scope 3 emissions. And that's where you may want to cherry pick elements of ISO 2400. So I would say start with a framework, and then you can add to it where you think it's going to either add value or reduce risk to your organization, and obviously reduce the impact on the environment.
yeah. Now, a lot of the targets people are setting now are things like net zero, and we've got the sustainable development goals, which are very ambitious as well.
Mm.
Is there a tension between those big sort of step changes and the sort of ISO model, which is intrinsically based around continual improvement
In relation to the SDGs
or net zero or,
or net zero?
or equivalents? Because, if
Mm.
there's I once read a joke that ISO 14001 allows you to destroy the planet in a well-documented manner. And was obviously that's a bit cruel, a bit harsh. There was an element of truth to it, I thought, because I've once a long time ago had some background in quality standards, and BS 5750 was it the precursor of ISO
Gosh, yes,
9000.
that's going back some time.
Yes.
Yes, yeah,
So I
yeah.
remember, yeah, grey in the beard. I
Mm.
remember that it's all about continual improvement year on year. and almost setting incremental targets rather than necessarily big stretch targets. So do you feel there's a tension between that sort of heavily documented, procedure-based incremental approach and some of these sort of stretch targets, shall we say?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think, we have seen some awful environmental management systems, and it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. There's a huge document there that actually it doesn't serve the business. It actually has a detrimental effect on the organisation, and that's something to be really wary of. I think the standards, they do get updated about every 8 years or so to reflect the change in industries and markets, for example, and what's going on in the wider world. And to be quite honest, it's as difficult as you want to make it. If you want to have a really simplistic framework for managing your impact on the environment as an organization, there are ways that you can do it, and it's just seamless.
Yeah.
It's incorporated and embedded within your organization's culture, your values, if it's done the right way. And that's I would always recommend creating a bespoke EMS. When we've implemented it for clients, it's almost unrecognizable actually in some cases. You won't see an environmental manual, for example. So if it's a law firm, it's part of their practice management system. And I think you need to try and make it effortless. You need to make it part of the organization's DNA in order for it to be successfully implemented. Because otherwise, if you've got, an unwieldy manual that's just kind of sitting on the sidelines, that's divorced from the actual business strategy, business objectives, business way of working, it's just going to cause stress when it comes to, for example, your annual visit from a certification body.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that does take time in order to be able to implement it within your way of working. In terms of how it relates to net zero, I think that organizations are looking for confidence, credibility, and transparency when it comes to, for example, even just understanding what their carbon footprint is and the methodology used. And I think that's where the standards can really help, because there are very clear definitions, very clear deliverables in terms of what good looks like. And we have to remember that it's not one organisation that's saying this is what good looks like. These are technical committees that have come together across the globe to clearly define what best practice is. And I think it's really down to an organisation whether they want to adopt that best practice or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we were first discussing you coming on the podcast, you said, I want to talk about ISO 14068, which you've mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And I must admit, I had to go and Google it to see what it was. And you mentioned it is very new. So that made me feel a bit better about not knowing what it was. But this is the one about carbon neutrality, which is obviously a hot topic and will probably continue to be a hot topic. So perhaps you could describe how that particular standard goes about addressing a thorny topic.
Yeah, so this you could call it the new kiddie on the block when it comes to carbon standards. So this brings together reference to ISO 14064, the carbon footprint verification standard. So there's a lot of referencing back to that standard. Okay, so this isn't a replacement of that. But in time, I think it will supersede PAS 2060. Based on my experience, that's typically what happens. There is a PAS or a BS or another national standard that's been created. And then when there is enough interest from at least 20 countries globally, when there is a demand in industry, then it becomes an ISO. So it's really interesting how I think this standard is going to, complement ISO 14001 in many respects. It's very much focused on, obviously, on the pathway to net zero. So the actual title is of ISO 14068 Part 1, Pathway to Net Zero and Carbon Neutrality. Okay, but there is a distinct difference between this new standard and the PAS 2060. PAS 2060 was more about the offsetting to achieve carbon neutrality and all about the claims.
Yeah.
And using credible offsetting partners, whereas ISO 14068 is a lot more comprehensive, I'd say, as a standard. It is very new. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any certification bodies or verification bodies that are verifying this at the moment. So it will be interesting. We're running a pilot at the moment on this standard just to see exactly what's involved with it. I mean, what I can say is that when it comes to carbon neutrality, there is a priority to focus on reductions and removals.
Yeah.
And offsetting is, last chance saloon type of thing. But the controls around the offsetting is much more stringent, which I think it should be, without a shadow of a doubt.
So, but I'm trying to get in my head, given how thorny this is, and there's stories almost every week about some scheme which rightly or wrongly is being criticized for not working or having been removed or whatever else, or human rights abuses. It's don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-offsetting. I'm not one of these people who think it's morally abhorrent, but there are clearly very difficult challenges in actually making sure that it's working. So I'm just intrigued about how the standard addresses those issues.
Yeah. Well, obviously, as I mentioned, it is focused on removals and reductions, but specifically in relation to offsetting, I mean, I don't know those offsetting controls off by heart by now, but I have got them detailed in front of me actually, and I think it might be worthwhile let me just go to them. I can actually highlight them for you. So basically, there are about 10 points in relation to the criteria for carbon crediting programs. Okay. And there are specific requirements. And when I say requirements, there is a shall in there, which again, there's no hiding from that. You have to demonstrate evidence of compliance to that. The carbon crediting programs have to be transparent with publicly available documented information on the carbon crediting program project cycle, including registration and verification requirements and procedures. They need to include safeguards with regards to impacts on ecosystems, biodiversity, communities, human well-being, human rights and local economies to avoid any adverse impacts where applicable. They also need to identify which sustainable development goals each GHG project contributes to. Gosh, the list goes on actually. You need to demonstrate stakeholder consultation. And one of the most interesting things I think that I've picked up on with this new standard is that you have to have independent verification of GHG emission reductions or removal enhancements, enabling the issuance of carbon credits. So this is a game changer when it comes to standards, as far as I can say.
Yeah, and
I think sorry, Gath, I was just going to say it goes beyond that in terms of the issue of carbon credits. There's very distinct controls around this as well, listed in public registry, and it all needs to be completely traceable. So this kind of, you could say, is there is a similarity with quality standards here. This is the first time we're actually seeing traceability with specific information around carbon credit ownership and status, unsold, transferred, retired, unique serial numbers, issued under procedures for permanent retirement, etc. So it's a very detailed list. I think this could be quite a scary standard for some organisations. For others, I think they'll be thinking, right, this is about time that we've got something that we can actually have some confidence in.
Yes. I walked past a van yesterday with certified carbon neutral, written on it, but it didn't.
Mm.
It didn't add any justification of who had certified it or anything. So that's
No,
why I'm very interested because we've had the
yeah.
controversy just over the last couple of weeks before we record this with the SBT. Sorry,
Mm.
say it out loud rather than using the jargon. The Science-Based Targets Initiative seemed to have had some sort of internal mutiny over a policy they laid down on offsetting stroke carbon credits, and it's clearly a hot topic. I can imagine the committee who developed that standard. I can imagine some quite difficult debates they had in trying to iron all these things
Mm.
out. But
Mm.
yes, it's an interesting concept, and I remember a few years ago everybody just said, "Well, go for a gold standard," but some of the gold standard schemes have been criticised for not quite
Yeah,
delivering what they say they're going to deliver.
it's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, we've seen in the mainstream standards, like ISO 14001, 9001, you'll see on a white van, 9001 on there, and it's just 9001 in a tick. Well, they're issued by so-called cowboy certification bodies that aren't actually UCAS accredited. They're not actually approved by the government.
Yeah,
And I think, unfortunately, we will be seeing that because there isn't any kind of regulations on it. So I think from an ISO point of view, you know, having a standard is one thing, but having it independently verified is another.
yeah,
So, and again, that's the difference between standards like ISO 14064, where you need to have a verification every 12 months,
hmm
but like an MOT, really. You can't always say that your carbon, this is what your carbon footprint is, because obviously it's going to change from year to year.
yeah,
But that is very different to certification of a management system to ISO 14001 or any other
yeah,
management system standards. And there is a very different set of criteria for the verification process as well.
yeah. And you know, obviously, say you're doing a pilot on this. uh, Is there demand out there or interest in the market out there amongst your clients for this particular standard, or do you think it might be a slow burner?
Uh, it's hard to say at this stage. I think there are a lot of other schemes out there
Mhm.
around net zero.
Yeah.
So I think there always has to be a driver in order for a standard to be commercially viable for an organization and for them to implement it. So, for example, for 50,001, ESOS was the driver for that. It's really interesting because one of the things that I'm doing in my spare time is I'm doing a master's by research in how carbon standards contribute to net zero.
Mhm.
And in some of the research, I came across that over 50% of the S&P 500 organisations are using ISO 14064 as a
Right.
framework when it comes to investments in organisations. So it's really interesting to see how these standards are being adopted globally.
Yeah.
So yes, there might be some net zero schemes here in the UK, but we need to look at what's actually going to be adopted at a global level to see, which route we go down. And yeah, it'll be interesting. I think organisations that are looking for clarity and
Mhm.
direction, I think will probably purchase a copy of this standard and then look to adopt it. But I think what we have to remember, Gareth, is that we're all on a journey with this.
Yeah.
And I think this is just,
Mhm.
one part of that journey. Um, but if people are, trying to figure out, even if they're just looking at offsetting, okay, so what guidance do I need around that? Then the standard can provide that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm just interested as well because I wasn't aware that there was the 1464. My ignorance of these standards is extensive. But uh the go-to carbon footprint printer, she swears by the greenhouse gas protocol rather than the ISO 14000 series. So is there any clash, I suppose, between opposing standards. I remember when EMAS was a thing, and it sort of folded into 14001. Is that likely to happen with various these standards, that they will join together and make the landscape a bit easier to navigate?
Well, interestingly, there is an annex that's actually dedicated to making a comparison against the GHG Protocol Accounting and Reporting Standards and ISO 14068. So yeah, that's Annex C, if anybody's interested in that. So yeah, it does make distinct differences between them, but there's a lot of commonality as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, you would hope so. So where are you seeing the demand in the ISO 1464, the ISO 1468?
Yeah, it's interesting over the last, year and a half that we've been established as a separate organisation at Carbonology. You would have thought that it was the carbon neutrality standard that would be the most attractive one, PAS 2060 and or ISO 14068, the new one. But actually, those organisations that are serious about this, they start off with ISO 14068 because they want that solid foundation
Mm.
for their carbon footprint reporting in order to then be able to make well-informed decisions in terms of where do they go from there. And actually, we found that some of the certification bodies went down the carbon neutrality route in offering PAS 2060 when actually it was ISO 14064, the carbon footprint verification standard that we've certainly seen in most demand. And it's interesting, I think, regardless of whether it's 14068 or PAS 2060, all businesses need to get to net zero. But those standards will always refer back to ISO 14064.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we're seeing the demand for verification. But the other factor is that although businesses know that they need to get to net zero, a lot of them, I think, are still thinking, oh, well, it's quite some time away yet. We don't need to worry too much about it. And we'll be able to offset nearer the time. When actually, the carbon credits are a finite resource
Mm-hmm.
and the costs are escalating already.
Mm-hmm.
So in reality, businesses may not be able to afford to be carbon neutral if they do go down the offsetting route. So I think that's just an important consideration. So establishing the 14064 now and looking at removals and reductions is definitely the way forward at the moment in offsetting. If you are considering it, you need to potentially look at locking those offsetting credits in now for the future.
So, this is obviously quite complex, but what's the most important piece of advice that you give your clients on how to approach the various standards?
Various standards. Yeah, it's a tricky one because we deal with about 20 different ISOs across
Yeah.
sustainability and quality at Blackmore's. But if you're asking me with my carbonology cap on,
Yeah.
um, first of all, I would start with looking at, okay, so what's the why? I
Yeah.
don't know if you've seen Simon Sinek's TED Talk, but that really does resonate with us as a firm. For our why at Blackmore's and Carbonology, it's all about creating a positive impact. And then it's understanding, okay, so how can we get there? How can we do that? How can we make that tangible?
Yeah.
Um, so, one of the first things we would do is look at, what have you done already? Where are we at? Have we collated our data so that we can understand, how we're using energy? Then looking at, we need to define the scope and boundaries of what
Yeah.
we're actually covering across scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And once we've understood that, we can obviously deal with the quantification. I'd say that that's the next stage.
Mm-hmm.
And that then obviously gives us an output,
Mm-hmm.
which is our carbon footprint. And that's where we can help to get a better understanding of how an organisation is contributing, to, greenhouse gas emissions and where are they coming from, how they're using them, looking at the sources. And then we can obviously look at the options moving forward in terms of establishing a commitment,
Mm-hmm.
to achieve X by X and to establish a carbon reduction plan, implement that. But I think the most important thing there is the monitoring and measurement.
Yeah.
So it isn't just a tick box one off, right, this is our GHG emissions report.
Mm-hmm.
It's a case of having resources in place, clear roles, accountabilities for who's doing what, where, when, and how.
Yeah.
Rather than the coulda, woulda, shoulda.
Yeah.
You need clarity on what you're doing as a business. I think, so it all starts off with the understanding of our why and establishing that carbon footprint, I think. And then obviously making sure it happens.
Yeah.
If it gets scheduled, in theory, it should get done. And that's actually one of the reasons why I created Net Zero 90 Days Planner. So not guaranteeing that you'll be net zero within 90 days, but you'll certainly have a robust plan in
Yeah.
place, because by dedicating time each day, or you may decide to allocate half a day a week with specific tasks, specific outputs and deliverables, you will get there.
Right. Very interesting. And the ISO Show podcast, that sounds like it passes the Ron Seal test. It does what it says in the tin. But tell us a bit about the podcast.
I started the podcast a couple of years ago. I'm from Cumbria originally, but live in Hertfordshire. And on car journeys, I'd be listening to podcasts, and I couldn't find any on ISO standards. A bit sad like that. Standards are my guilty pleasure. So I thought, well, why not do one ourselves? Because ultimately, I just wanted to share hints and tips and dispel myths around standards.
Yeah.
Because, as you said earlier, there is some negative press about them if you implement them in the wrong way. I just wanted other people to share their stories and insights into best practice, really. And that's where it began. So we have covered quite a few on, well, I'd say probably at least half are on sustainability, even though we cover a broad range of standards. So if anybody wants to find out a bit more about how, for example, how standards align with the SDGs,
Yeah.
it's really interesting actually. ISO 14068 meets 16 out of the 17
Right.
SDGs.
Yeah.
I think the best one though is probably ISO 26000, the social accountability standard, that meets all 17. But that's a
Right.
guidance document
Yeah.
that is quite extensive. But yeah, interesting if businesses are looking for a framework for that on the social part as well of
Yeah.
ESG.
Absolutely. And is that available on Apple Podcasts and
Mm,
Spotify and what
yeah.
all the usual platforms if people want to go and find it?
Yeah, that's right. On all the mainstream media players, just look up the ISO show.
Yeah, and they will find it. Okay, well, Mel, thank you very much for that. I think that gave us quite an in-depth look at the latest in the 14,000 series and other standards. Oh, sorry, I'm obsessed a bit with 14,000, but and it's been a learning experience for me because I dip in and out occasionally rather than live this, but it's always very useful to know what the latest standards coming on. So thank you for joining us today.
Very welcome. It's been a pleasure, Gareth. Thank you very much for inviting me.